Well, good morning, everybody. It's good to be with you today. And as Joe said, my name's Caleb. If you don't know me, I'm one of the pastors here at H2O. And so we're glad that you could be with us today. And we're picking up in our series in Genesis. So we've been walking through Abraham's story this summer in Genesis. And we're picking up where we left off in Genesis 19 this week. And I just want to begin by acknowledging that this is a difficult passage, as Josh talked about last week, if you were here with us, that this is a passage that involves the judgment of a city and also some, what is something that is disgusting that really happens between one of the characters and his family members. So I'm just giving you fair warning that that is up to the passage that we're talking about today. So no one is surprised when we talk about what we're talking about. So I just to be fair, if you're unfamiliar with Genesis 19, that is what we're talking about. But I also want to acknowledge something on a more positive note about this, that the Bible is authentic, okay? And I think that's what we crave right now in our society, is something that's real, something that doesn't pull the punches, something that is honest about what is happening, okay? And that's what we see in the Bible. It doesn't really diminish the bad things that even some of the positive characters do, So like with Abraham, for example, we've already seen some of the bad things that Abraham has done, even though he is the one who is supposed to be the founder of Genesis in a sense, right? That he is the beginner, the first patriarch, if you will, of the nation of Israel. But it still tells us about the bad things that he has done. So the Bible is real. And also, when we're talking about this passage, although it is difficult, we don't want to skip over it because we want to teach you guys how to deal with some of these more difficult or uncomfortable passages as well. So we like to read through the book so that way we don't just pick and choose things that are nice or easy, but we're real about what the Bible says. So that way somebody talks to you and you're not surprised. Oh, I didn't know this was in the Bible, okay? If you're just in Sunday school, you're probably not going to read this passage, and that's probably an appropriate choice, okay? Let's just be real. When you read it, you'll see why. And so, that this is something that's in the Bible, and it's good to be aware of and how to interpret it and work through it, okay? So all that preface brings us to Genesis 19, okay? And so last week, what Josh talked about, the sinfulness of Sodom. And as we have heard earlier on in the story of Genesis, God says that the sin of Sodom rose up to him, that people were crying out against the city and the sin that was there. And then we see God send his angels into the city to see and inspect the city to see if there are righteous people within the city. And then the men are met by Lot, and he shows some hospitality, some positive things. But then the angels are met with this group of people that wants to do something very inappropriate with them, okay? And so these men want to do this with these angels, and then the angels blind them, and then they tell Lot, you have to get out of the city, okay? And so that is kind of where we are picking up today. And so today, the format of what we're going to be doing is I'm going to read a smaller section and walk through some things, and then we're going to continue and work through to the end of the chapter. So we're going to read a section, take a break, talk about it a little bit, and then continue on in that format, ending with some, what is the significance for us today? So if you're taking notes, that's kind of what the format is going to be. All right, so we're going to start in Genesis 19, and we'll start in verse 23. So if you want to turn there in your Bibles, it'll also be up on the screen as well. So Genesis 19, starting in verse 23. All right, and it says, the sun had risen on the earth when Lot came to Zoar. And we'll just stop for a few seconds here, okay? So this is something that is happening early on in the morning. And typically, if you're into art, okay, and you look at like Renaissance art and different depictions of this, it's typically at nighttime. But what we see is that this is happening in the morning as the people are about to go to work. That is kind of the image that is painted for us here. All right, so people are getting up for their work days as this is about to happen. So let's pick up in verse 24. It says, then the Lord rained on Sodom and Gomorrah sulfur and fire from the Lord out of heaven. And he overthrew those cities and all the valley and all the inhabitants of the cities on what grew on the ground. And we'll just stop right there really quick. So this is not necessarily the cheeriest picture, but what we have seen is what's been alluded to several times in Genesis. This isn't a surprise to us as the reader. Earlier on in Genesis, it says the city had not yet been destroyed. So if you're just reading Genesis cover to cover, if you will, this is not a surprise to us. We knew this was going to happen, but it finally is happening, that this city is being destroyed. And there's been so many explanations of, like, scientifically, how did this happen? Some people are like, it was an earthquake, it's a volcano, it's, a lightning, it's literal sulfur and fire. And honestly, we just don't know, okay? Let's be real. And I think, it's kind of fun to think about those type of things, but at the same time, I don't know that it really teaches us that much. We know that this city is being destroyed. That is the main thing we're seeing, is that this city is utterly destroyed. So, okay, not only is God destroying the physical buildings of the city, but all the inhabitants, all the livestock, and all the agricultural development of the city is destroyed. So there's nothing left, okay? That is the picture that the author is painting for us, that God utterly destroyed this city. And I think it's important to remember why, because if we just jump into the story here and we don't know any of the background, this may seem like strange or unfair, but let's remember why God is doing this, okay? Because this is a situation where God explicitly tells us why he did something. He doesn't always tell us, but in this situation, we have multiple verses in multiple books of the Bible that explain why this is happening. And so the first, I'm going to look at three different reasons that are listed in the Bible, okay? And so the first one is that, I'll get to Genesis first. So Genesis tells us that this city is exceedingly wicked. We also saw the sin in Genesis last week where that Josh talked about, that the men wanted to have relations with the angels, and we saw that this was sinful. And so these men did not see any righteous people out of the hundreds, if not thousands of people. They did not find 10 righteous men like Abraham had prayed about in chapter 18. So I think we see we shouldn't have this overly sympathetic view of Sodom, okay? This is an utterly wicked city. And so now let's talk about the three reasons, which I have up on the screen here. The first one is they had no indication of repentance or regret for their sin. This was not an accidental thing that these people were doing. They were running towards it, okay? That's what Isaiah tells us when he talks about Sodom and Gomorrah, okay? He's saying that they were not like, oh, I'm going to go turn to God now. No, they were embracing their sin and running towards it. The second thing we see is sexual immorality is told, and that's told to us in Jeremiah and Jude. Okay, so sexual immorality is one of the reasons that we saw a glimpse of that last week, like I've alluded to earlier. And I think something that some people that are really into this, like Genesis, want to kind of make an argument for is that it's because the messengers were angels why this was sinful. But I don't think that's the case. I think it's more that they wanted to have a sexual relationship with them outside of the bounds of marriage between a man and a woman. And the reason I think this is because there's no indication that the men earlier on in Genesis 19 knew that these people were angels. They were in the appearance of men. Additionally, if you look at that verse I have in Jude at some point, you'll also see that it says that these men were seeking to do what the rest of the valley was doing, essentially. Okay, so this was not a new thing. This was enculturated within these cities. That this was a common thing. So I think that is what we see here. This is the sexual immorality that the Bible is talking about. And then the third thing, which many people don't necessarily think about when we come to this passage, is that the people were prideful and exceedingly prosperous and did not help the poor, okay? So this was a very affluent community, Sodom and Gomorrah. They had lots of money. It was perfect for agriculture, and that's why Lot chose it in the first place, okay? He intentionally chose it because of that reason, because he knew that he could do well there. And so these people were making all this money, and they were very wealthy, and they were very well-to-do. And they were so focused on themselves that they didn't help others. They were just solely concerned about themselves, very prideful and selfish. And this is one of the reasons God condemned them. And so if we're at first hesitant to say, oh, well, this is a just thing for God to do, throughout the Bible we're given many reasons as to why he did this. So this isn't just like, oh, God, off on a whim does this, but it is very clear why God did this. And he gave us these clear reasons as to why this happened, okay? So let's pick up in the story at verse 26. But Lot's wife behind him looked back, and she became a pillar of salt. And this is an interesting and perhaps weird part of the story. And I think I kind of picture this as, if you're familiar with Pompeii and the volcanic eruption there, kind of like one of those people that's frozen in time as a result of the eruption there. Is kind of a helpful image that she is basically frozen in time in like rock or salt or however you want to say it. But I think we should ask, okay, well, why did she get turned into this pillar? Why did she basically become a statue instantly like this? And the first reason is, well, the angel earlier on in Genesis 19 said, do not look back. So there's the one reason, right? They're explicitly told not to do it, but she does not trust the angel in that aspect. The second reason is, I think, the question behind the question. Why did the angel tell her not to look back? And my take on this is that she wanted to linger in the sin and remember the financial prosperity that Lot and his family had in Sodom. And she did not want to focus on the salvation that God had for them in saving them, right? She wanted to cling to sin and the sinfulness of the city rather than pursue what God had for them. And I think this, because I think Kevin DeYoung helpfully pointed this out, that Jesus actually references this verse. And fun fact, that where Jesus references this is the second shortest verse in the Bible. Okay, the first shortest, Jesus wept. Fun fact for you. Second shortest, fun fact for you, number 2, is that remember Lot's wife. So you can add that to your memorization plan, and you can say, man, I memorized that verse. That was easy. Right? So remember Lot's wife. So this is in Luke 17 that Jesus references this, okay? And so he is referencing this in regards to choosing to follow him. And so if we're following him, we need to remember Lot's wife, that we're not looking back at the sin and the treasures of this world and things like that, but we're looking solely to him. So Jesus relates this to our call to follow him. Are we seeking material wealth, the prosperity here and now, the desires of this world, or are we so focused on Christ that we can just leave all that behind? That is what Jesus tells us about this passage. So we'll move on to verse 27, okay, in Genesis 19, and it says, "And Abraham went early in the morning to the place where he had stood before the Lord. And he looked down toward Sodom and Gomorrah, and toward all the land of the valley, and he looked, and behold, the smoke of the land went up like the smoke of a furnace. So it was that when God destroyed the cities of the valley, God remembered Abraham and sent out of the midst of the overthrow when he overthrew the cities in which Lot had lived." So we'll stop right there. So what we see here is a picture of, earlier on in Genesis 18, Abraham prayed to God and interceded for the city of Sodom. He knew that Lot was living there, his relative, and he was praying for the city. And he said, God, 50 people who are righteous live there. Would you spare it? And God says, yes. There's, 45, 40, and he gets down to 10. If there's 10 people, would you spare the city? And God says, yes. So he returns to that spot where he was interceding for Sodom, and he looks out. So he's kind of on this mountaintop type of area, and he's looking down upon the valley and what has happened. And so he kind of sees the answer to his prayer there. But the author reminds us of something important about this passage as well, that Lot is saved. So God does answer Abraham's prayer, okay? He does answer his prayer. And so I think something we often miss in this section, we're so focused on the sinfulness, the destruction, the hard things that are here, that we often forget this encouraging fact that God answers a prayer in this section, okay? That's important for us to remember. All right, so don't forget that as we read this section. But now what we're going to kind of do is switch gears to a second scene, all right? And this is perhaps the more difficult scene for some of us because, honestly, it is quite difficult to understand, especially in our modern context, and quite disgusting to hear about. But let us remember what we talked about earlier, that, while parts of the Bible are difficult to understand and perhaps uncomfortable for us, it's important that we read them, because what we read in Timothy is that, the Bible is for our instruction. It is for our good, even if it is difficult to hear. So just to give fair warning yet again as we continue on into this second scene. So picking up in verse 30, now Lot went up out of Zoar and lived in the hills with his 2 daughters, for he was afraid to live in Zoar. So he lived in a cave with his 2 daughters. And at face value, jumping into the story, that sounds kind of weird, right? That's these guys living in a cave with his 2 daughters, right? So why would he choose to live in a cave over living in a city, right? That may, especially in our modern context, that's kind of a weird thing to do, right? But I think what we see here, if we understand Lot's perspective, a legitimate fear, okay? What's happened in Lot's life over the past couple days is an angel showed up to his house telling him the city he's living in is going to be destroyed, okay? Then he doesn't believe him at first, and then there's an angry mob outside his house, okay? He survives that. Then the angel tells him again, you got to get out of here, okay? Then the angel drags him out of the city while it's being right before it's about to be destroyed, and then his wife dies, okay? All of this is happening in like a period of like a day in his life, okay? So I think it's pretty fair to understand his fear in this situation. I think if we look at it from his perspective, I think we would all pretty much be freaked out by this as well. So Lot is afraid that this new city, Zoar, will be destroyed like the city of Sodom and the city of Gomorrah. So he's afraid of the judgment of the Lord, and so he understands that God punishes the wicked, okay? That is what he is saying here. So now let's pick up with verse 31, and we're going to finish out the rest of the section, and this part is the more difficult part, as I have warned you. So verse 31, and the firstborn said to the younger, our father is old, and there is not a man on earth to come into us after the manner of all the earth. Come, let us make our father drink wine and lie with him, that we may preserve offspring from our father. So they made their father drink wine that night, and the firstborn went in and lay with her father. He did not know when she lay down or when she rose. The next day the firstborn said to the younger, behold, I lay last night with my father. Let us make him drink wine tonight also. Then you go in and lie with him, that we may preserve offspring from our father. So they made their father drink wine that night also, and the younger arose and lay with him. And he did not know when she lay down or when she arose. Thus both the daughters of Lot became pregnant by their father. The firstborn bore a son and called his name Moab. He is the father of the Moabites to this day. The younger also bore a son and called his name Ben-Ami, and he is the father of the Ammonites to this day. So here we have a very disgusting, revolting section. I think we can all agree on that, right? That is safe to say. And I think what might be helpful is to explain some of the cultural reasons why the daughters may have done this, okay? So this is not in any way to excuse the actions of the daughters, because it's clearly wrong, and that is clearly outlined in the Bible. But here is kind of the mind frame they're working from, so that way we can understand it a little bit. So if we think to Abraham and Sarah's story, the big deal is that they don't have a son, right? And I think this is helpful because Abraham and Sarah are perhaps more relatable than Lot and his family, okay? I think that's safe to say. And so Abraham and Sarah wanted this child really badly, but they weren't able to. God promised it to them. But they were willing to, by any means, kind of seek to make this happen. And so that's why Abraham sleeps with Sarah's servant, right? And that's why they do that, is because carrying on the family name is so important in their culture, okay? Our culture doesn't necessarily care about that much, but in their day, it was a big deal. But additionally, Lot's daughters had more concerns, okay? So what they're thinking about is not only will we not carry on the family name, but if they don't get married, they don't have any protection once Lot dies, and they're living in a cave, okay? Not the safest place to live if somebody comes along or if there's wildlife or whatever, right? And additionally, their financial options would have been limited. So they had no plan necessarily to make a lot of money or provide for themselves very easily. And so if they did not get married, they did not necessarily have a plan for the future, okay? They don't have 401ks, IRAs, that type of stuff back in this day, all right? There's no Social Security, nothing like that for them to fall back on. All right, so they needed to find a husband. We don't know why they couldn't find one, if it was because they were poor and living in a cave, or just there wasn't anybody around who wasn't married yet. We just don't know, okay? And so we see this awful picture that they resort to this and they don't trust God in this situation. And what we also see is the biblical tradition of the importance of names here, okay? If you see the name of a place in the Bible, the name of a person, there's probably a lot of meaning loaded into that name. And so when you look at it, look at the meaning of the name. So the first son is Moab, and it means from or of the father. And I think you can put two and two together there, right? And then the second son is Ben-Ami, which means of my people. Again, I think you can connect the dots there, right? So we see that these names represent the origin of these peoples. And this is truly a disturbing and difficult story to understand. But I think something that can help us to understand it a little bit is look to how this echoes the story of Noah. Okay, this is an echo of the story of Noah. And let's just kind of compare those side by side. Noah is told by God that the world is going to be flooded, right? That there's going to be a flood, destruction is coming. We also see this with Lot. The angels tell Lot that destruction is coming. So they both get this destruction story of what's going to be told. We see that Noah is faithful to build the ark that God tells him to build, and then is saved by the ark. And then we also see Lot is saved by the angel, okay? And then it also ends on the same type of note. The story of Noah ends with him making a vineyard, getting drunk, and then there's a weird sexual thing that happens with him and one of his family members. And then again, we see the same in the story of Lot. So there's kind of this this judgment and salvation paradigm that is started here in Genesis with Noah and then with Lot here. And so this is kind of one of the fundamental themes of the Bible is judgment and salvation, that God will judge sin, but he will also provide a way for his people. And so we see this motif carried on throughout Genesis. We also see in the New Testament that Lot, despite his many failings, is identified as a righteous man. And that might be hard to believe, right? I think it is kind of hard to believe at times. You're like, Lot, you made so many mistakes. You did dumb things. Why are you a righteous person? And I think ultimately what we see is up until the end of his life, similar to Samson, who doesn't really choose to fully follow God until the very end. Lot also doesn't really, until the very end of his story in Genesis, actually seek to follow God. And he's not perfect along the way, just like us, okay? We also, when we follow God, follow him very imperfectly. We make mistakes along the way. And as much as we may not want to relate ourselves to Lot, I think he is probably the one we are supposed to relate to the most in this story, imperfectly following God. That in the end of his life, Lot did not look back at Sodom. He didn't look back like his wife did. He kept looking forward to the salvation that God had for him. And yes, he still made mistakes, getting drunk in the caves and things like that. He still has some responsibility there. But he did listen to the angel and what God had for him. God did save him. And so I think this should lead us into the significance for us. What do we do with this? This is so broken and messed up and difficult. But what can we do with this story? If God's word is actually profitable for us, if there's actually something we can learn from it, what is that? And I think the very first thing we should point out, obviously, is we should ask ourselves, do we run from sin towards God? Do we run from our sin and run towards God? We need to turn from sin towards God. And this is one of the things that Jesus points out in the verse I referenced in Luke. Do we value something or someone over God? God is the one who ultimately deserves our allegiance and everything in our worship, okay? Because we should not worship anything created. We should worship the Creator. And this is what we really see in the story of Lot. While Lot is kind of dragged to the end, he does end up looking forward and not backward. And his wife is the opposite, right? She's the non-example. She looks back at the sinfulness and the things she once had rather than looking forward at the salvation that she had away from the city. And so we need to move forward pursuing God. And we may make mistakes along the way. Lot made many mistakes along the way. He made bad choices, and he did pay a cost for those bad choices. But we need to look forward and run towards Christ, not the sins of the past. Second, we should ask ourselves, do we take seriously the sexual ethic God has for us, okay? And so this isn't necessarily popular or comfortable for some of us, but what we see in the Bible is a clear sexual ethic, that sex is for marriage between a man and a woman. And that's not a popular thing to say, but what we see in Genesis 19 is some of the consequences of this. And that's not to say to be mean about it, but that's just to declare what the Bible actually says, right? That the people of Sodom, their culture and everything was so used to this type of sexual sin that they didn't even seek to hide it. They were just willing to do the sexual sin out in the open. And we also see this with the daughters that say they have somehow been affected by this culture. That, our culture tends to divorce sex from having children, but that's not the only reason that we should have sex within marriage, right? We tend to not think of it in that way, but they only thought of it in that way, and they used it as a utility to get what they wanted rather than be in the correct relationship, okay? And so that is hard, and that is something in our culture that we don't necessarily want to accept. And if that's something that you're like, man, I don't know, that's really hard for me, and I'm struggling accepting that, please talk to me, talk to Joe. We'd love to have a conversation with you about why we think that and why that is our position on this, all right? And the third question we have is, do we trust God? Do we trust God? And I think this is the question that underlines the whole story that we see in chapter 19. When we see Lot choose a land earlier on, he chooses what is appealing economically, not what is appealing spiritually. He doesn't necessarily trust God with his financial situation. And he doesn't at first trust the angels to actually take him out of the city. Okay? He doesn't trust them and what they're saying. Lot's daughters don't trust God and their provision for their relationships and their financial situation. But in the end, I think we do see Lot trust God, and he continues to look forward and doesn't look back like his wife. And what we see here is we need to trust God in his ways. And this is what we see so much in the story of Genesis up to this point, right? Look, thinking all the way back to Adam and Eve, they didn't trust what God said about the tree in the garden, right? They didn't trust that what he said was actually true. And this is what we've seen with the story of Abraham up to this point, too. That Abraham, when he sins, it's often because he doesn't trust that God will come through with what he says. That he doesn't trust that God will provide a child in the land. And so what we see in the story is that one of the main roots of sin is a lack of trust in God. We don't trust his designs in creation. And this is what we see with the men seeking to fulfill their sexual desire in the earlier section, and this is what we see with Lot's daughters as well. We also, in our context, may not trust the judgment that God has for Sodom in this story, okay? We may, in our context, think that is not something that God should have done. We may struggle with seeing God completely destroy a city. But what we see throughout Scripture, as I've explained, is that there are many reasons why God did this. And he was justified in his decision. And I think, I'm not trying to say that we shouldn't ask why God does these things, but I think when we're asking these types of questions, we must also accept our own limitations, right? If God is really the creator and we are the creature, then he is above us, and his ways are higher than ours are, right? His ways are higher than ours. And so we may not always be able to understand everything, right? We may not always know why God does certain things. And we need to accept that and trust God based on what he has shown us and revealed in his character. So what I want to end on today is an encouragement to trust God. That if you've never repented and believed in Jesus, now is the time. Because we have all sinned and we are all worthy of punishment and destruction, right? That is what we all deserve. And here we see an image of the judgment of sin that we all would deserve, right? And so if we embrace our sin rather than God, then eternal punishment awaits us if we don't have faith in Jesus. And essentially what faith is, it is trusting God. And it's trusting in Jesus and basing our whole lives around Him and what He has done for us. And now is the time to do it if you have not. Now, on the other hand, if you have trusted in Jesus and you have repented and believed, the question is there an area where you're not trusting God in your life? Because the reality is that life is hard, right? And we all know that. We've all lived through difficult things in our lives, whether it's difficulty related to health, finances, relationships, any of these different things are struggles that are real in our lives. But when it comes down to it and we're in these difficult situations, do we trust God's power and character in these situations? That He is, if we are following Him, that He is going to do something good at the end of the day through it. And this is hard, and this whole section is hard, right? This is not an easy thing to talk about. It's not easy to focus on, right? This judgment aspect. But the reality is that is what God tells us. And so when I'm wrestling with, trusting God, something that I do is I pray through the Psalms, and certain Psalms in particular help me to trust God. And so that's kind of how I want to end this time today is through praying through a psalm, okay? And I'll read this psalm as I pray it, and so if you guys want to bow your heads, you can. If you want to read it up on the screen, also feel free to do so. So if Jason's going to come on up, and we'll finish with 2 songs after I read this psalm. So it's Psalm 46 is what we're going to read here. And Psalm 46 says, God is our refuge and strength, a very present help in trouble. Therefore we will not fear, though the earth gives way, though the mountains be moved into the heart of the sea, though its waters roar and foam, though the mountains tremble at its swelling. There is a river whose stream make glad the city of God, the holy habitation of the Most High. God is in the midst of her. She shall not be moved. God will help her when the morning dawns. The nations rage, the kingdoms totter. He utters his voice, the earth melts. The Lord of hosts is with us. The God of Jacob is our fortress. Come, behold the works of God, how He has brought desolations on the earth. He makes war cease to the end of the earth. He breaks the bow and shatters the spear. He burns the chariots with fire. Be still and know that I am God. I will be exalted among the nations. I will be exalted in the earth. The Lord of hosts is with us. The God of Jacob is our fortress. So let's go ahead and stand and sing as we close out our time here.